Hello, hello. I'm thrilled to hear Joelle speaking about holding back models when they're deemed unsafe, and talking about how open source is the standard, which fundamentally changes how they think about projects from the earliest points of development. Now, when it comes to open source, there's one company in particular that has been a leader for an extremely long time. Please join me in welcoming the president of Mozilla, Mark Surman.
Hello, good morning. As you just heard, I think there's going to be some slides. Oh, there are. There's slides. I'm Mark, and I'm from Mozilla. And I want to talk today about public AI. And the idea that we don't just need commercial options for AI, but also public options. And in particular, I want to talk about how open source is a key piece of that. Oh, but I keep losing my slides. There we go. So I want to talk about public AI and how open source is a key piece of that. So obviously, if we step back, there is tons going on about AI. This whole stage is about AI. We're all excited about it. Certainly, Mozilla is. And there's challenges. There's challenges with things like privacy, things like copyright, and challenges with affordability and democratizing stuff, although we heard a lot about that in the last talk. And of course, some companies, Apple in this case, are trying to tackle pieces of that challenging landscape. So Apple recently came out with Apple Intelligence, which includes a lot of on-device AI and secure computing environments. So you see people not only getting excited about AI, but looking at how we can tackle the challenges. And one of those other challenges is the democratization of AI, making sure everybody can build with it, change it. And open source is a key piece of that. And what I want to dig into as I talk about public AI is also, what do we mean by open source in this era? Because it's different than when Mozilla came up 25, 20 years ago. So I'm going to dig deeply into that. First, I want to talk about why open source matters. And there's a lot of reasons. It's something I've worked on for most of my career, even before coming to Mozilla. But a really critical thing that I think many people either forget or don't know is that open source for the last 20, 25 years has been the Lego kit, the fundamental building blocks on which most of the tech industry, but also on which education, innovation, research, government services have been built. If I'm building Facebook or Amazon or Google 20 years ago, I build on top of Linux. But also, if I'm a researcher, if I'm trying to build the next large language model, there's so much open source under the hood. And certainly, it's behind a lot of government services. And there's a recent Harvard study that is quoted here that Lego kit of open source, and I think it's actually missing some things in its calculations, has created almost $9 trillion in value over the last little while, after the last couple of decades. So imagine if that didn't exist. So given its centrality to everything we are trying to do, not just with AI, but with our digital society, and making it possible for startups and everybody to participate in that, it's important to step back and say, what is open source and what makes it work that way? And about 20 years ago, around when Mozilla was getting started, I guess 25, there was something called the Open Source Initiative, that also, there's a lot of acronyms here, created something called the Open Source Definition. And what the open source definition did was it said, this only counts as an open source license, this is very nerdy, if it has these 4 elements to it. The license allows you to use the software, study the software, like it's transparent, you can get inside it, that's the open part. Modify it means make something else from it, make your own version or build something else that extends it, and then share that thing, including actually shell services on top of what you've shared. And it's this definition, these 4 elements that define what open source software has done or been, or that we can rely on it, and has allowed that $9 trillion in value to emerge. And so we now have the question, what is open source AI? And the same people, the Open Source Initiative, have spent the last year asking that question. What would it mean to have a definition of AI that we could rely on in terms of open source? And what they said is pretty simple. It's complex in its execution, but pretty simple. That all of these things, not just the software, but the models and the model weights, as well as the data, need to actually live up to these 4 things. We need to be able to use, study, modify, and share something for it to be open source AI. Again, very nerdy, but it's going to matter as I get to this idea of a public option for AI. Before I do, just one side note, and Phil just talked about that. The economics are changing. The economics are changing because AI, unlike software, which has a 0 marginal cost, costs a lot of money, both to train and to serve with inference. And what that's doing is throwing up into the air some of the economic assumptions we've had for the last 20, 25 years, including, let's say, I get Alexa for free because I paid for or I get the AI inside Alexa for free because I paid for the device. But now Amazon is looking at changing that bargain. And one of the things we want to pay attention to is, will that happen with open source? Will developers have the rug pulled out from them if they build on some of the open source AI that is coming out today? And the licensing question matters a lot because it relates to that, to the certainty that you can always use what is being called open source. So let me now get to this core concept of public AI. And we put out a paper earlier this week where we're talking about having a public option for AI, which is a complement, not a competitor, but a complement to all the commercial AI out there. Just like many people in this room probably have private automobiles, but you'll drive beside a bus or a streetcar or a train, and certainly all of them are on public roads. And so we live in an ecosystem of transportation where the freedom or the economic value of being able to drive is enabled by public infrastructure and complemented by public infrastructure. And we think we need that in AI in order to move forward. And what that means is having an element of the AI ecosystem or a complementary AI ecosystem where public use, anyone can use it for anything, public orientation, meaning AI that's used for education, for healthcare, for public purposes, and most importantly, public goods and open source are a part of the AI ecosystem. And I think as we saw the kind of boom of OpenAI over the last few years, my concern is we're going in the opposite direction of that, taking what has been open research, locking it down. So, what do we mean by that and why is it important? I think we just need to look to the past to have examples. In the previous era of the internet, we had open source knowledge in Wikipedia, browsers, and the web, operating systems. And the simple version of saying, what do we kind of look for to know if we're headed in a direction of public AI is, are these public goods that we saw in the previous era starting to emerge? So let's take a few minutes to look at that and then look at how we kind of might all, if we care about this idea of a public option, move forward. So here is a hyper-simplified version of the AI landscape. And I'm a little sad because I'm here in Toronto, where I'm from, and I put Mila at the top and not Vector as well. But this is looking at 2 dimensions of how I see and Mozilla sees the AI landscape. Obviously, a question of open and closed, and it is a spectrum. But also this question of public orientation and commercial orientation. And you can be doing public good and be commercial, and you can have commercial elements and be oriented towards the public good. That's what Mozilla does. So we do see this as a spectrum, and it's not exactly accurate where everybody is placed. So if we want the public goods part of public AI to be something that flourishes, how are these players contributing it? Where are we now in pointing towards a public option for AI? One of the things that has really made me excited in the last year or 2, since everybody started paying attention to LLMs and since the kind of big ChatGPT boom, is a real flourishing and in some cases creation of new institutions in the nonprofit open source LLM space. And so it's a very specific, nerdy thing. But I think like the Linux Foundation, the Apache Foundation, the Mozilla Foundation, there is a need for institutions whose whole purpose is to be building public goods. And there's 4 of them up there. One I'll call out is the Allen Institute for AI. AI 2. They just released last week Molmo, which is a small 1B version of their Olmo model. And one of the things that's striking about it is not only that it's a small model that is, outcompetes or competes with Llama and the GPT-4 models on some benchmarks, not everything. It's, for particular things, it's very good. But also it is open from end to end. It fits that definition of, the data, the software, the models, all being open according to the open source definition. And we don't have much out there that is like that. So that's a really exciting trend, is these nonprofit open source labs building public goods. You also have some companies who are not necessarily in the public goods business per se, setting up kind of public goods projects or arms. And so Cohere here in Toronto, which isn't really in the open source business per se, has set up Cohere for AI, which has a public goods focus and releases things as open source. Hugging Face, which is a great player in open source, also built Bloom, which is a purely open source LLM built with academia. And then, of course, we just heard from Joelle, and I put that kind of little funny face there, not because we question Llama. We built something, we love Llama, we build on it. We built something called Llama File that lets you use it on a laptop, use it on a local device. And Llama has been a huge boon and counterpoint to what OpenAI has built. But there's a question there in terms of licenses, and this actually gets back to what do we need for public AI and what is the definition of open source? There's a set of restricted uses in the license. There isn't data transparency. And most importantly, there's a cap of 700 million users in terms of being able to use Llama under its open source terms. And so that's like, imagine Mark Zuckerberg built Facebook on top of Linux, which he did. And he hits 700 million users, which he did. And Linus Torvalds comes into Palo Alto, knocks on his door, and says, oh, actually, Linux isn't free anymore. Here's the bill. Like, open source can't work that way. And certainly one of our asks of Meta is that they change that aspect of the license in particular. So where does Mozilla fit in? We're not an AI company, although we've worked more and more on AI in the last few years. We've set up both a venture fund focused on trustworthy AI and a separate arm focused on open source AI to start to look at how we take what we did for the web, do it in the AI era. But we're just getting started. One of the things we really want to do is work on this public AI option, work on open source that truly includes open source AI, that truly creates public goods with all of these players. So what does that look like? What does it look like to gather a community? Much like we did 20, 25 years ago when Microsoft dominated the web, when they owned the server room, when they owned the browser, when they owned databases. And you had all of these players like Linux, like Apache, like Mozilla, as well as commercial players, IBM, Red Hat, even Sun, coming together and saying, we need to build an alternative. We need to build public options. And that's the moment where we are now. And I am excited about it and actually optimistic about it. And doing it takes all of these players and hopefully all of you, developers, companies, activists, lawmakers, and consumers. And what do we need to do at this moment if we want to make the public option a reality? There are three key things, and we talk about these in our paper. One is build a vibrant open source community. We need public goods in the AI era that fit with that definition that all of us can build on and rely on, from startups to big companies, from governments to artists, everybody. We also need public investment in open source AI. We've seen huge announcements around publicly funded compute in the US and Canada, elsewhere in the last little while. But those need to be tied to a condition that those public dollars get used to create public goods. In the US, the National Institutes for Health, in health research, make it so if you get their funding, you have to release your research as open research. When we have public compute dollars or public investment in AI, those are the same kind of conditions we need. And then the last thing is we need a supportive policy environment. And you just heard earlier about Governor Newsom in California vetoing SB 1047, which was a law that was going to create a chill on open source research. We're really happy that happened. We pushed hard, Meta pushed hard, others pushed hard on that. But we need more than just to stop that kind of legislation. We need AI safety, AI competition regulation that actually includes open source as a part of the solution. And we believe the momentum is there for this kind of public option in AI. We believe both private and public players have a role in it. And we believe that there is actually the next Wikipedia, the next Firefox, the next Linux for the AI era on the horizon. And we're interested in building with people. Thanks very much.